instead of suffering, our economy suffering in order to clean the atmosphere, as most people worry, actually it creates jobs, creates GDP, creates exports, creates economic progress, because it's a profitable economic activity. Removal of CO2 can be a profitable economic activity, at least with our technology.
Welcome to the Business for Good podcast, a show where we spotlight companies making money by making the world a better place. I'm your host, Paul Shapiro, and if you share a passion for using commerce to solve many of the world's most pressing problems, then this is the show for you. Welcome to episode 22 of the Business for Good podcast. This is a special episode because we have a cameo appearance by a guest host with me today, my friend, Joanna Bromley. Now, Joanna is too humble to tout her own credentials, so I'll just let you know that she's probably more qualified than I am to be hosting a podcast about business, seeing that she earned a degree in economics from Duke, an MBA from Harvard, and has worked at both Goldman Sachs and Bain, and has co-founded not one, but two plant-based food companies, including, full disclosure, one with me. Joanna's and my guest today is also someone who knows a thing or two about business. The daughter of Russian Jewish immigrants, Graciela Chichilnisky spent her youth in Argentina, immigrating to the United States, where she completed not one but two PhDs in math and economics, respectively. In addition to being an econ professor at Columbia University, she's really one of the world's foremost experts on climate change and is the CEO and co-founder of Global Thermostat, a startup that's now raised $52 million to literally suck CO2 out of the atmosphere. Why do I say that she is an expert on climate change? Well, remember the Kyoto Protocol back in the day, that climate agreement the US never ratified? Well, Graciela is best known for proposing and designing the carbon credit emissions trading market underlying the Kyoto Protocol, and she also was a lead author on the 2007 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that just happened to win the Nobel Prize. Not too shabby. Her startup, which she asserts can quickly start addressing the climate problem, doesn't focus on reducing emissions, which she grants, of course, is critical. Instead, it focuses simply on inexpensively sucking CO2 directly out of the air. In other words, the same way that a dehumidifier removes water from air, Global Thermostat does the same thing, but instead capturing carbon dioxide in order to cool the planet down. If she succeeds, we could quickly, as the name Global Thermostat implies, set the temperature of the planet, thereby perhaps averting a climate doomsday scenario that many experts warn is already unfolding. In this interview, we'll hear how the technology works, where it stands now, and how Graciela responds to concerns raised by critics about this plan. It's a fascinating listen, so enjoy, and let us know what you think by messaging us on the Business for Good website. Professor Graciela Chichilnisky, welcome to the Business for Good podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure being here.
It's a great honor to have you with us. You have a very illustrious background, and we are really grateful to take up some of your time to chat about your career and what you're doing to try to help avert some of the worst effects of climate change. But before we get into that, it would be great if you could just give us a little bit of your background. I know that you grew up in Argentina. You now are a U.S. citizen, but you grew up in Argentina. Tell us a little bit about the circumstances of your youth and your trip to the United States back then. I believe you arrived in the U.S. Was it in the late 1970s?
No, I think closer to the earlier 70s, actually. Okay. And the circumstances were the political situation that emerged that turned out to be quite lethal and very lengthy, in which there was a coup d'etat by the military who took over the government, closed down the universities, and left me, who was at that point the secondary school, high school student, without the ability to go to college. So the main reason for my trip to the US was to go to MIT, and I managed to go as a graduate student, PhD student in mathematics at MIT without ever completing college. So that gave me a head start, and it was very, very interesting. Great, it was great. So it came from a very awful situation into a wonderful situation. It was was great in that sense.
And so did you come with your entire family, or did you just come over yourself to MIT?
I had a child that was a year and a half, who is now a chair professor at Stanford University in neurobiology, and experimental physics. And my child came with me. I just came along with my child.
Wow. Well, the apple did not fall far from the tree in this case.
Well, yeah, he's great. My son is great, yeah.
Well, how did you manage having a child and going to school? Were you going to school full time?
Yes, I was going to school full time. I had a Ford Foundation fellowship for my PhD in mathematics at MIT. And it was very difficult because the time was very limited. You just couldn't do everything you wanted. MIT had a great library that was open 24 hours a day. And for me, that was the closest thing to paradise at that time. So there you go.
Oh, wow. Did you live, just out of curiosity, because I'm from Boston, did you live in Kenmore Square? Where in Boston did you live?
No, but I used to go to Kenmore Square quite often. And I used to go to Legal Seafood, where it started, actually. And but I lived generally in that area, and near Harvard, in the back streets there. It was great.
So, Graciela, you're now getting your PhD in math, and I know that you actually have 2 PhDs, not one. Also, I believe in economics. At what point did you become interested in climate issues? Was this during your education? Was this after you became a doctor? What was your introduction to the climate issue?
When I was finishing high school, I was extremely active intellectually, and I started working with a group of wonderful scientists, an interdisciplinary group in Argentina. And I continued doing that even while I was in Boston, in Cambridge, actually. And the group was creating a model of the world economy that became famous and was adopted by the United Nations based on the concept I created of economic development based on basic needs, on the satisfaction of basic needs instead of GDP. Now, that group, some of the people there became presidents, and Furtado became a president of Brazil. Very illustrious and very intelligent and wonderful people. It was called the Bariloche model. I became the author of the mathematical part of that model, where I created that concept and mathematized it, and put the data to it. That concept of basic needs was adopted and voted by 150 nations in 1992 as the main concept of economic development in the Rio de Janeiro Earth Summit, and became the foundation for sustainable development. In other words, sustainable development is all about the satisfaction of basic needs. It's not about GDP for the present and for the future. So that's what I was doing at that point. In the process, I realized that the main issue globally were the natural resources. And that the natural resources, according to the Club of Rome, which is the model that we responded to, were in the process of extinction or running out. That was the Club of Rome limits to growth, famous limits to growth model of the meadows. And the Bariloche model was a response to that model, also a computational model, from the point of view of the developing nations, the perspective of the developing nations, because the limits to growth was premised on the fact that developing nations could not develop without destroying the world because of their use of resources. And we showed that if you actually follow basic need policies, that is not true. That was my concept of basic needs. That's how sustainable development emerged. And in 1992, the concept of sustainable development, which is with a cornerstone on basic needs, emerged and was popularized by the Norwegian minister and became, since then, all-encompassing to the extent that a group of 10 has sustainable development as its main focus. So I worked on sustainable development from there on. That was in the 70s when we produced the first book on catastrophe or new society, which at that point became a bestseller in 9 languages. I was one of the authors, and the others were this fantastic team of scientists that I was working with that included geologists, etc. And it became clear to me that the issue of natural resources was the heart of the entire problem. Now, it is clear to me equally that the environment is really all about natural resources, and I realize many people don't think like that. But it depends on the definition of natural resources. Air, water, biodiversity are natural resources, and they are the key issues for the survival of the human species, because without water, you don't survive for more than a few weeks. Without air, you don't survive for more than a few minutes. And without biodiversity, you simply won't survive because you can't eat. So those are the 3 items for survival. Those are the main resources and the most scarce resources in the world economy today. They may not sound like they are the most scarce resources, but people now understand that potable or drinkable water in the world is right now the most scarce resource. And if you think about it, clean air or air which is not polluted by CO2 is, number one, the most dangerous risk faced by humankind. And therefore, the exhaustion of that resource is the issue. So all of that became clear to me in the process of doing the Bariloche model with basic needs, sustainable development. And since then, it occurred to me that there had to be a solution to the problem because it was so critical for the survival of our species. And I've been working on that since then in various ways, various different ways. And I continue doing that, believe it or not. That's what I do.
So, Graciela, we totally hear you that we are consuming vastly more than we should be. We are doing things to the planet that are going to really risk our civilization and the existence of numerous other species on the planet as well. You have started a company to try to reverse some of the problems, the emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions that we've been putting into the atmosphere. So if you could tell us a little bit about geoengineering in general first, it would be really helpful to get a basic understanding, because a lot of people are likely familiar with efforts to reduce the number of emissions we're putting in the air. You, however, are working on a company that would actually remove emissions from the air that are already there. So tell us, why did you decide to do this, and what is it exactly that your company, Global Thermostat, is doing?
So since I discovered everything I told you, I have been working ceaselessly. I have not stopped working on the problem. And as you probably know, in 1997, I actually created and then wrote the carbon market into the Kyoto Protocol. It's a market that is now used in a large number of nations, and over 25-30% of humankind. In the United States, for example, is used in California and several other states officially. But I realized that in my work, where I was the US lead author of the IPCC, which is the world's leading scientific authority on climate change.
The and for those who aren't familiar with IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change.
Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, indeed. It's an institution that houses thousands of scientists all over the world. And during the period that was the US lead author is when the IPCC received the Nobel Peace Prize together with Vice President Al Gore.
Congratulations.
2006. Well, as I said, the Nobel Prize was received by the IPCC, not by me personally. But as I said, at that point, I was the US lead author. And the main thing about it is that the IPCC was able to discover, among other things, that the CO2 pattern of remaining in the atmosphere, not decaying like particulates do, it just doesn't fall down, it just stays there, implies that at the levels that we have reached, our carbon budget is basically exhausted. And that means that the only solution now is not to reduce emissions. That won't do. Is to remove what's already there. This that became very clear to me because, as I said, I had this leading role in the IPCC at that time. And two things happened. One, I created 4 years later a company to resolve this problem, having co-invented the technology that could remove CO2 from the atmosphere, from air, directly from air, at such a low cost that it could be commercially profitable, which means that instead of suffering, our economy suffering in order to clean the atmosphere, as most people worry, actually it creates jobs, creates GDP, creates exports, creates economic progress, because it's a profitable economic activity. Removal of CO2 can be a profitable economic activity, at least with our technology. What I'm telling you is the reason why I created that company, as a way to redress the fact that the carbon market, that was the real solution, because markets are very powerful in order to move things around much more than governments, in my view, but it wasn't fast enough. So having co-invented with my colleague Peter Eisenberger the technology that we have, created a company to actually put it in action and make profits from it, because I couldn't convince the United Nations to adopt this technology. They thought it was crazy. They thought it was impossible. And that thought continued since more or less 2011 to the present, until last year, October 2018. There were three extremely important reports. One by the United States National Academy of Sciences, another one by the IPCC itself, the Fifth Assessment Report, and the third one by the National Security Administration, NSA. The three of them in the month of October 2018, which is an incredible coincidence, all of them saying the same, which is what led me to create a company in 2011, which was that it no longer suffices to reduce emissions. Now we have to remove physically the CO2 that is already there. And the company was created, or I co-created the company with my colleague Eisenberger, to execute that business plan. In other words, to remove CO2 from air and make money from it, creating on the way a new world economy that, instead of being based mostly on petroleum, is mostly based on CO2, which I can explain. So the reason I created the company is because I wanted to accelerate the objectives of the Kyoto Protocol of limiting carbon emissions, this time removing it, along the lines of what the IPCC itself published in 2018 was needed, along the lines that the National Academy of Sciences published in October 2018 was needed, along the lines of what the NSA published in October 2018 that was needed. All of this happening in October 2018. So what happened then is the realization and the acceptance of the main scientific bodies in the US and globally that the only solution is to remove CO2 that is already in the atmosphere. And the National Academy of Sciences went a step further. They created a committee on what's called direct air capture, which is what our company does. We are the only American company doing this. And this committee that they created estimated what they thought would be the cost of doing this if it was scaled up. And the idea was to see how feasible it was in cost terms to clean the atmosphere as needed. And they ended up in that report that you should look at, the National Academy report of October 2018, saying that a technology like ours, which they don't mention by name, but they do mention in the details, listed there carefully and clearly, can eventually lead to $18 per ton of CO2 removed. And the reason that number is important is because CO2 sells for a wide variety of prices over the world, but they're all much higher than 18. For example.
So what is your company, when you capture the CO2, who are you selling it to and how are you making a profit on it?
Right. That's the key question. I mean, it's one of the key questions. So if you look at carbonated beverages like Coca-Cola, they spend about $400 million every year buying CO2. The same thing is true of Heineken. And CO2 for Coca-Cola and Heineken is very scarce and very valuable. And each price goes between about 100, and $1,000 or even higher than $1,000 per ton. And remember what I just said, that the National Academy believes when we scale up, it can go all the way down to $18. Not today, but when we scale down. So this is what matters, and that's how you make money. We already are at a low enough cost that we can make money with the Coca-Colas and the Heinekens. But in addition, more interestingly perhaps, there is the question of biodegradable fertilizers, which are so important right now. And they could be poisonous based on nitrogen, but based on CO2, they're not. And that's very important.
If you sell your CO2 that you're capturing from the atmosphere, let's say to a Heineken or to a Coca-Cola, they put it in their beverages, and then when someone opens a bottle, the CO2 escapes back into the atmosphere, right?
No.
Okay, please correct me.
No. You're not wrong. Some of it escapes. So it's a question of how much. So in reality, when you drink a Coca-Cola or a glass of beer, you notice the fizz, right? That fizz is CO2 and it's going into you. If the fizz was gone into the atmosphere, it will be flat.
I see.
And you wouldn't drink flat beer, would you?
I see what you're saying. Does it escape my body eventually, or do I absorb it into my body? Like, am I capturing it myself if I drink the soda?
Yeah, I didn't want to go into these details, but if you go to the bathroom, then any liquid that comes out of you is going to bring the CO2 into the soil.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But that is not, as it turns out, the best way to remove CO2 and stabilize it on Earth. So there is the following are very good, excellent ways to stabilize the CO2 that we remove from the atmosphere, making money at the same time. One of them is water desalination. Like in the Middle East, most of the water is desalinated. Another one is the production of polymers, which are also biodegradable, like plastics. Another one is the production of carbon fibers, which is what every boat and soon every plane in the world are going to be using instead of metal. And many automobiles like BMW are already using to replace metal. And that's a huge market because just the replacement of aluminum and steel is $1 trillion market right there. So, I mean, I can keep on giving you more examples, but there is cement, there is aggregate that uses gigatons of CO2 or CO2 equivalent, and therefore can remove as much CO2 as more or less as we need to remove right now and stabilize it on Earth. And what's the aggregate and the cement market for? The production of roads, the production of buildings, etc., uses an enormous amount of aggregate and cement. So you are talking about gigatons of CO2 that can be stabilized like that. And the reason I mention gigatons, which means 1 billion tons, billion as B, as in boy, is because right now humans put out into the atmosphere about 36 gigaton a year.
So what exactly is Global Thermostat doing? I mean, how are you capturing the CO2, and is it theoretical at this point, or are you actually doing it?
It's not theoretical. We built already 3 plants, and you're welcome to come and see number 2 in Silicon Valley at SRI, which is 333 Ravenswood Avenue. It is the largest technology campus, the most illustrious in Silicon Valley. And we have our plant number 2 there operating, and you're welcome to come and see it. It's cleaning the CO2 from the natural gas power plant at SRI, which initially was Stanford Research Institute. And in addition, removes more from air. So that's what we call carbon negative power plant complex. It's the power plant where they produce electricity, and we take the heat, which is residual and free, and use it to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. So with the result that at the end of the day, you are producing electricity while cleaning the atmosphere of CO2 and not the other way around. This is very important because right now, 45% of all the global emissions of CO2, by far the largest part of the emissions, come from the production of electricity in the world as a whole. And right now, we are on course to double our production of electricity, mostly in developing countries. So that's plan number 2. Plan number 3, which is perfect for a classical bottler, a bottler of a classical carbonated drink, is 4,000 tons of CO2 per year. It removes 4,000 tons of CO2 per year. It costs in the low single digits of million, which is by itself a breakthrough because the CO2 plants have been huge and incredibly expensive and never worked. So this one works. It's not extremely expensive. It produces below the cost that is needed to make money, as I mentioned before. And it's relatively small, with the result that people can just bring it on site, send it inside the container, install it, and it produces the CO2 that you need on site.
You say it takes in the low single digits of millions to operate. I presume that means that you have brought on investment for the company. So if you're able to disclose, how much investment have you brought on and who are some of the investors?
Sure. So far, we brought approximately $52.5 million in about 9 years. To build all those plans, to develop the technology, to build the company, the commercial relations and the contracts on which we are working and right now, commercial contracts. So the company now finally is commercial, but only initially. We don't have 10 years of commercial activity because it took all this time, like 9 years, to develop and test, etc., the technology and find the right mixture of everything. So this is $52.5 million that we had to fundraise, and now is going to require a lot more money because although you make a lot of money, you have to invest the money before you make it. So I don't know if that answers your question, but we built 3 plants already, and the third one is commercial. Yeah.
It's very impressive, and it certainly does answer the question. Thank you. So there are some folks I've talked with who are enthusiastic about the idea of carbon capture, although they'll say, we have other methods of very inexpensive carbon capture, mainly in the idea of planting trees. What would you say to them when they say, hey, why not spend millions of dollars just planting trees, which are essentially columns of carbon sequestration themselves? Obviously, the two are not mutually exclusive, but do you have thoughts about those 2 competing strategies?
The trees are one of the most important living species on the planet, not just because they are columns that absorb CO2, but because the forests are essentially where biodiversity resides, and because they are in a synergistic relation with animals, in the sense that animals breathe oxygen and emit CO2, and the CO2 that we emit is breathed by the vegetation, including the trees, which then they exhale in the form of oxygen. So there is a synergy between animals and vegetation, and trees are critical there. And of course, we are. It's almost ridiculous, if it wasn't so tragic, destroying the tree, the foundation of the combination of gases and this carbon cycle that I just described, which is so critical for our survival in destroying the trees. But we are destroying the trees, and we are destroying all the forests. And just about one of the most important things we can do is to try to restore trees and generally vegetation to the planet. So you're not going to find me talking against trees.
Yes.
But I wanted to say, no, I mean, you have no idea. I mean, and people don't really understand what a tree is. The trees are networks, and they're connected under the earth, and they connect to each other. It's an extraordinary ecosystem. But let me not talk about that. I just wanted to say the United Nations carried a study. And that study was, can we, or if so, how can we use trees to overcome the potentially catastrophic climate change situation? So you're not looking at me on this. You're looking at the United Nations study that was actually carried in Canada that said that there isn't enough land on the world to do what is needed now. And one of our plants can do the same thing that millions of trees can do, just in terms of CO2. The trees are doing much more, because of what we said before. But in terms of CO2, that is a fight against time, then what we do has the speed that is needed, and the United Nations proved beyond any doubt that trees don't. And the studies that I mentioned before by the IPCC, the National Academy of Sciences, and the NSA reinforce what I'm just telling you. I wanted to say, so therefore, what I'm trying to say here is that as incredibly important as trees are, and there is no competition, just we need them. We need them immediately, and we need to continue growing them. And we're doing exactly the opposite. We're destroying trees big time right now, forests, etc. But they simply have their own timing. They operate in millions of years, and our species cannot hang around for millions of years if we have catastrophic climate change and our civilization survive under those conditions. So that's why you need time. Actually, is everything here. We do have the technology to resolve the problem, and it's even profitable. But timing is critical. We cannot use trees because of the timing issue. We cannot. Everything that I'm telling you, you'll say, well, if there is a solution, then why are we worried about it?
Yeah, so I want to play devil's advocate here for a bit. So what if it just seems like if you're sucking CO2 out of the air, it seems like that just creates an incentive to not to just continue producing it. And that gets into a broader question of there potentially could be unintended consequences of doing that. So I'm sure you've heard this before, but I'm very curious how you would respond to that.
Well, actually, the Washington Post wrote an article in which they go in detail over our company, and they quote me as saying, I am worried that our technology may create an incentive for people to continue emitting because now we can take it out. So I am worried about it. You're not wrong. The only question is, are you worried enough to just freeze and do nothing? Or shall you continue improving the technology, trying to remove the CO2 from air and make sure that people decrease their emissions? I mean, I am the author of the carbon market of the Kyoto Protocol that was all about decreasing emissions. So I'm not worried about my motivations. But I do understand that the other companies or other circumstances where people may think they can get away with murder because there is a way to remove CO2. And the answer is no, they can't get away with murder. We need to do everything here.
Right. And I think also I share the concern that it may disincentivize emissions reduction strategies. But I also believe that even if we stopped all emissions today and we went to zero CO2 emissions anymore,
that's not enough.
Right. We still would have too much CO2 in the atmosphere and we still would have to remove it. And the life cycle for it is something like a century, right? It's not like methane where it clears pretty quickly. The CO2 will last in our atmosphere for a long time. So I feel about it similarly to the way I feel about plastic, which is that, yes, we want to come up with ways to produce plastic that is biodegradable, but we still are going to have to figure out ways to and invent ways to degrade the plastic that we already have rather than letting it sit around for millennia. And so I think carbon capture is one important strategy in that entire matrix.
The three institutions I told you, which are the defining institutions in the US and globally, the National Academy in the US, the IPCC for the UN globally, and the NSA for the US, all three say that the necessary and sufficient condition to resolve this question is direct air capture. In other words, what we are doing is sufficient for removing the threat of catastrophic climate change. And it's also necessary. In other words, this is it. Anything that you want to do about climate change, if you're going to solve the problem, it has to go through direct air capture, according to those three reports. That's why I'm doing it.
And so obviously you're doing this because you think that there's a real role for business to play to help solve the climate problem. But are there ways that government can help to incentivize companies like yours or to reward them? Like, how do you envision the government helping to advance the carbon capture market?
Okay, so I did more than thinking about it. I actually worked with Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island and Senator Barrasso of Wyoming. And they asked me to provide a proposal of a legislation, and that means working with government. And it was passed it's now part of the budget, and it's a law called 45Q. That law, also known as the Future Act, offers practically unlimited tax credits of approximately $35. Well, it's exactly $35, but you have to define things properly, per ton of CO2 that we remove from the atmosphere. And that means there is a role for governments. The role for governments in this particular case I just told you is an unbounded amount of tax credits so that to provide incentives for industry to grow these technologies and make money and keep some of this money because more of this money because they have a tax credit. $35 a ton is quite a lot, and it's not limited. If I remove 1 billion tons, the tax credit is $35 billion. So that's pretty serious. And so I did that. I provided a proposal, and these great senators provided then all the work that was needed and the ideas, etc., and they made it into a law. There is right now another law called Use It, which is essentially a way in which finance, which is obtained for the purpose of building this type of equipment that removes CO2 from air, will be taxed. The finance, let's say, if it is a bond, it will be a tax-free bond that will create an incentive for the public to invest in this area because the bond will have a return that will be tax-free. So that I'm just giving you high level the type of legislation that exists as of 2018. All of this happened in 2018 and 2019. Both February 2018 is when 45Q passed as a law, and February 2019 is the Use It Act that I mentioned before. So yes, in addition to the private sector, it is possible for governments to have a positive role. But my concern about governments, I'm not against the government, please understand that. I'm just trying to say that if it suffices to watch things to realize that governments are in a state of challenge all over the world. This is not an American situation. It's true in every continent. And it's particularly true in the United States. So I do not wish that something as important as our civilization should be held hostage to the fates of a political cycle that may be very, very difficult to stabilize or to move in the positive direction right now. I don't know. I really don't know. I don't think anybody knows.
I'd be curious what you think about. So the UN recently, the UN has said that animal agriculture is responsible for more emissions than transportation. I'd be curious how big of a problem that you think that raising animals for food is in terms of climate change.
Well, I don't think it's as serious as it's made to be, because 45% of the global emissions come from electricity production or power plant. So the industrial sector is by far the largest. However, what happens is that if you put together the production and the transportation and distribution of the meat industry, it's terrible. And it, in some cases, has been measured to be over 20% of the global emissions. So if you want to do something yourself individually, stop eating meat, or at least reduce significantly your meat consumption, which has other benefits too. It's more healthy and it's nicer towards the animals who are, after all, our friends.
So you mentioned reducing meat is one way an individual can actually help reduce their climate footprint. What are some other things that individuals can do to help solve some of these issues?
Well, I think, reducing the consumption of meat is probably the most easily accessible and fastest because it can be done very quickly. And you might have noticed that the meat industry has noticed that too. For example, I don't know if you heard about the Impossible Burger. So Burger King produces now a hamburger that is vegetarian. And apparently it's very highly liked, and that shows that you can go vegetarian and have great taste and profits at the same time.
I can personally attest, Graciela, it is a delicious burger, and it definitely it tastes like meat with far fewer emissions. Let me ask you, just going back a little bit, in terms of what Global Thermostat is actually doing. Like, if you're able to share, how does the technology work? Obviously, I'm not asking you to give away the keys to the kingdom here, but what are you doing that is capturing CO2 and
Just about everybody I know has seen a dehumidifier in action. A dehumidifier is a piece of equipment that you put it in a room and it moves the air through it. And as the air goes through it, the molecules of water get captured. And then at the end of the day, there is a tray underneath that is full of water. And that is the water that has been removed from the air in the room. And the air in the room is now dry. That's a dehumidifier. How does it work? Well, it works because it has chemicals inside it that are like sponge, that have a lot of affinity for water. So when the air goes through, what comes in is wet air, and what goes out doesn't have the water because the water has remained captured. Okay. You can think of our technology as having produced incredibly effective, giant dehumidifiers. But instead of removing water from the air, we remove CO2. Same concept. Yeah. So it is not as mysterious. What is mysterious is how to do it without spending too much money, which is the easiest thing to do, because you have to move so much air, millions and millions of tons of air, that the process of moving air could be extremely expensive. Okay. And then the question is, what can you do to lessen the cost? And essentially the treatment of how you deal with moving air that is in our technology is an invention, which is what our invention is, our patents are, that is not far off in terms of novelty, the idea of flying a plane. So you remember that in the 1906, the Wright brothers invented a method for flying a plane, and part of that was managing the air as it goes through is critical. Management of air as it flows is what allows a plane either to fly or to crash. So one of the things to avoid, for example, is turbulence. Everybody who studies flying knows that. Well, we have the same problem. In other words, the handling of millions and millions of tons of air going through so that it is not turbulent and is not expensive is the secret of this, because the nature already provides substances called amines, amines, which are made of, roughly speaking, nitrogen, that have an enormous affinity for CO2. So the question is not to find something that grabs hold of the CO2, captures CO2. The question is how to handle the whole thing and moving the enormity of air that you need to do to achieve the job at a reasonable price. So that's what we're...
Okay. So I know we're coming up at the end of our interview here, and we want to make sure we respect your time, but super quickly, for people who are interested in learning more about these topics, what resources, so books, videos, podcasts, anything, would you recommend?
Okay, we have a website, not surprisingly. And in the website, there is, depending on your interest, there is a lot of technical material, but there is a movie that is called Carbon Negative that was made by director Paul Atkins from the National Geographic. And it explains everything I've been talking about here in a few minutes, in like 10 minutes or so. And that movie is what I would recommend. Go to Global Thermostat website, look for Carbon Negative, and it will give you the whole background, and it will actually show you the plants, how they work, why they work, and the entire ecosystem of how you remove CO2 from the atmosphere and you stabilize it on Earth and you make money in the process.
Great. Thank you. We'll certainly include that video in the show notes. And then finally, Graciela, we always ask guests at the end of the show, for what are you grateful in this world?
Well, I'm grateful for so many things. I don't even know where to start. I suppose, first of all, grateful to my parents, my absolutely wonderful parents, amazing, and the life they gave me, and my children, and my entire ecosystem of friends and colleagues, and the fact that I can work in something that I really enjoy and I find very important. So my life has hopefully some meaning. So I'm very grateful for that. But as grateful as I am, I have to admit that we are living in an unusual point in history. I couldn't believe that I was born in a point of history where everything is coming to a peak and where human civilization, for the first time, both dominates the planet, dominates planet Earth, and also has become its worst enemy in the sense that it could cause our demise, the demise of our civilization. This never happened before. This level of control by humans of the Earth systems is totally new, and I can't believe that I was just born in that moment of time and somehow oriented myself to trying to see if this can be resolved and how quickly this can be done. So that's it. I mean, I'm very grateful, but I have to tell you, I don't know if witnessing what's happening now is something to be grateful about.
We certainly can't choose when we're born, but what a time to have been born and what an opportunity we have to help avert one of the, if not the greatest crisis of our entire species history. And we're grateful to you, Graciela, for using your entrepreneurial skills and your scientific background to help try to create a business that can actually address the climate crisis in a meaningful way. So thank you very much for everything that you're doing. And thanks for taking time to chat with us.
Thank you.
Thank you. I enjoyed talking with you.
Thanks for listening. We hope you found use in this episode. If so, don't keep it to yourself. Please leave us a 5-star rating on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast. And as always, we hope you will be in the business of doing good.